Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about the film Dinosaur from 2000. Dinosaur is part of a period where Disney, for their animated films, were using computers in kind of interesting ways, most famously, I guess, during the Disney Renaissance with the Beauty and the Beast sequence, and then even with the deep canvas stuff with Tarzan and Treasure Planet and Atlantis. Dinosaur is probably the most experimental Disney has gotten since then, really. They had bought a visual effects company named Dream Quest Images, which they later renamed The Secret Lab, and put them to work at making their own animated film, which was originally considered separate from the Disney Classics canon, but now is considered part of the Disney Classics canon. Getting into the logistics of that is confusing. Apparently in some countries the wild is included and this isn't, but in majority of countries this is included and the wild isn't, but whatever. And they made a film that is combining computer generated imagery superimposed over actually shot live action backgrounds. And it's an interesting idea. I actually hadn't seen it before I reviewed this movie, but I do remember when this film came out and I felt like that was a really cool and interesting thing to do. And in the early days of CG, it seems like no one really knew exactly what to do with it. And probably because Disney didn't want to make a fully CG animated film, at least just yet. They would do that 5 years later with Chicken Little. But at this time, they didn't want to step on Pixar's toes, I guess, or wanted to keep doing traditional kind of animated films or different things with CG before fully going into the thing that they have pretty much done for the past 10 years, except for a few traditionally animated exceptions. It's an interesting experiment, this movie, and one that I think probably would work a lot better now, technology-wise, than it did then. But the real problem with this film, and probably why this film has just only become a nostalgic piece for a particular generation and mostly been forgotten about by everyone else, is that the plot and the dialogue are pretty horrendously bad, and the plot itself is really just a big ripoff of a much more beloved animated dinosaur movie, The Land Before Time. So although it is very experimental and interesting in its animation, it leaves you with something you've already seen before but done a lot worse. The dinosaur Aladar, who's raised by a bunch of lemurs after his egg is abandoned from the nest that he is in after a Chronotaurus attack. The egg is bounced all over the place and then eventually gets in the claws of a pterodactyl, or at least what looks like a pterodactyl. I'm not a dinosaur expert, but is flown eventually to this island of lemurs, and then Aladar is raised with a bunch of lemurs, and life is grand and wonderful until meteors hit and destroy everything, and they have to go and try to find a new place to live. And they eventually find all these dinosaurs migrating after they run away from a bunch of velociraptors, or what look like, I think they're velociraptors. He finds a bunch of dinosaurs migrating to greener pastures, or what they call the nesting ground, as Kron, the leader, is leading them on and trying to get them there before predators will come and get them, and doesn't care about the weaker dinosaurs on this journey and this migration, acting like Darwinism, survival of the fittest idea, that if they get left behind, that's basically their fault. Whereas Aladar doesn't believe in that, and he believes in life and is trying to save the older dinosaurs in the back to hopefully get them all to the nesting grounds so they can all survive. The writing is really the biggest problem, because I couldn't even find a review that would criticize the animation, and I'm not going to criticize. I think the animation is really cool. It's cool to see films that were animated in a different way, and there's no other real films like that. And this was actually a very expensive movie. It was the most expensive movie of 2000, which might sound like a joke or something, but there were actually a lot of very expensive movies that year, and to do kind of an experimental animated film and have that be the most expensive movie of the year was pretty awesome and amazing. 2000 was an interesting year for animation. I mean, you had a big hit stop motion film like Chicken Run in the same year, then DreamWorks was just starting. You're really starting to like see things changing and go in different directions. It was basically the beginning of the animation era that we're living in now. It showed that Disney was willing to take risks and change it up, because clearly they knew that things were going to be changing. It's smart to make this kind of movie. With Secret Lab, when Disney bought Dream Quest Images, who had done visual effects work for E.T. and Escape from New York and won Oscars for The Abyss and Total Recall, and then were bought and made Secret Lab after they were Dream Quest Images, and had them work on various touchstone films like Armageddon and Mighty Joe Young, and other films like Gone in 60 Seconds and Bicentennial Man. Eventually had them develop their own movies, and this was their only real one movie. They started developing one called Wildlife, but it never really went anywhere, so who knows what that was going to be. It's interesting that Disney kind of considered having a different animation animation studio within their own studio, which they already kind of had with Pixar, but we're considering doing that with a different one as well. Although they do that with stop motion now also, so it shows they're open to that experimentation. But I think the problem with Secret Lab is they clearly weren't working on the script enough. Originally, the idea of this was that dinosaurs wouldn't talk to differentiate this from Land Before Time, which this film needed more of. And it was originally actually pitched by Paul Verhoeven from RoboCop fame, way before the Disney Renaissance and this whole idea. And it was originally a much darker movie, and then it kind of got shelved for a long time, and then they kind of brought it out after the Disney Renaissance was over, and they got, I guess, a little more desperate. The idea of Dinosaur, and they're trying to find the nesting ground, which is basically like the Great Valley. It almost feels like there's a genre for dinosaur movies, and they all have to find this place where they can live after a meteor hits. It wasn't like The Land Before Time was like this little movie, like most people, especially the target audience, had probably seen it at this point. So it was a little odd. But also because I think the dialogue is like bad animation dialogue, and that really holds it back. Because as much as they have great actors like Ozzie Davis and Joan Plowright, Juliana Margulies, and Alfred Woodard, and Della Reese, and a lot of great actors in this, they're saying like the worst, most hackneyed dialogue in the world. At least in Land Before Time, they never made references to things and said like cool, funky dialogue to stay current with the kids. It just felt natural in a way that like there's no part in that like dates Land Before Time, but Dinosaur feels dated. Now, obviously, these films take place when there were dinosaurs, so that part is dated, but the dialogue themselves, this feels like a very 2000s era movie. It doesn't take place in the 2000s, but the way they wrote the dialogue is very cliched and hackneyed. And I think Disney usually would try a little better than this. I'm not a huge fan of this era in Disney animation, but I kind of expected more considering how much they had on the line with this movie. It feels like they just really thought more about the visuals. I feel like this was probably why they didn't continue on with this, because they knew, sure, they could make money with this, and this film was financially successful. It's kind of odd that when I brought this movie up to people, they just don't remember it, because it was the 5th highest grossing film of 2000. Like, it was successful. It actually opened against Battlefield Earth. It was a sizable hit. It actually came out a little after Gladiator, I believe. It was a big movie. It wasn't financially unsuccessful. It just doesn't seem as remarkable as it really should for everything it has on the line, just because, like, why are you ripping off Land Before Time so heavily? But also, it was very concerned about not doing a Tyrannosaurus Rex in this, because why isn't the Tyrannosaurus Rex the main antagonist? Instead, they have this other dinosaur. And apparently it was because while they were making this film, The Lost World was in production. They felt that made Tyrannosaurus Rexes look less evil. But it's also like, well, yeah, but you have velociraptors. Like velociraptors are almost like considered mainly a Jurassic Park film. I know they were like a real dinosaur, but when I see a velociraptor, I instantly think Jurassic Park. So like, why was that okay? Is it because they changed the design? And apparently they did try to be historically accurate, but then they went, I don't know, I mean, let's just make these dinosaurs look cool. And they make them look often a little ridiculous and silly, and the designs aren't the greatest. It's just kind of that bland CG kind of feel to it. Actually, for 2000s, this CG is very good. It doesn't age that well, but for that era, I can understand why people were blown away by the visuals for it. When a film in a studio tries to be ambitious and tries to be experimental and tries to do something different with a new medium, I kind of almost want to give them credit, because film studios aren't really known for being experimental and different and trying new things, and that Disney was willing to do this and that it worked out for them. I kind of wish it had worked out better in terms of, you know, script, but instead it's a film that, like, I kind of understand why people don't remember it. It wasn't a film that blew me away. It was a little hard to get through. It was cool watching the visuals, and I think superimposing visuals that they really shot with film cameras, that they actually had cinematographers on this film, often worked for it. But it borrows from too many things. There's too many shots that feel lifted right out of Jurassic Park. The James Newton Howard score feels like, I honestly checked to see, I was like, did John Williams do this? Because it feels like such a rip-off John Williams score. It's unique enough of a movie that it's kind of odd. Like, why, when you have a different kind of film, there's no other film like this film, are you borrowing from Land Before Time and Jurassic Park? And you have this Darwinism idea about survival of the fittest that I think could be kind of interesting. It's not played in the best way. It's kind of just a big movie with a bad script. It's what you expected from an early 2000s film. They weren't the best written, but they're usually like kind of cool looking and they'd have cool effects, and this falls in line with that. If you're interested in different kind of animated films and to see how Disney at one time could do different things, they didn't just make movies where princesses look like Barbie dolls and stuff. They actually made different kinds of films, and I think in the early 2000s they were open to that more with the deep canvas stuff with a film like this. I think this is the studio at their most experimental, that they do something like this, that they make a different studio to not just make a stop motion film or have Pixar do their thing, but this is like not a brand that's been set before. I think Disney deserves credit for making a film like this. It doesn't work, really. It feels like a bunch of other movies. It's just a crappier version of The Land Before Time, which is a much better movie. But I still find it an interesting discovery of an animated film. It doesn't really become anything other than that, but it's worth a watch once. And then you can move on and watch The Land Before Time for the rest of your life, because that's a much better version of this same story and feels a lot more original. I kind of wish they had done the idea of having this without any voices in it at all to differentiate from Land Before Time, but they did nix that idea. But much like I said with The Land Before Time, and even though Roger Ebert complained about that with this movie and The Land Before Time, no one was going to spend $100 million on a weird dinosaur art movie. Although that does sound like a cool movie, I don't think that would ever happen. That sounds very financially unviable. Michael Eisner said the same thing. That probably would have made it a little more interesting, and I agree would have differentiated it more. But unfortunately, the movie we have differentiates itself in terms of production and differentiates itself in terms of animation. But in terms of the script and the actual plot of the movie and the experience of watching the movie, it sadly doesn't feel enough like a different kind of film. It has an amazing opening sequence. It has a lot of amazing different things about it, but it doesn't differentiate itself enough in the ways that matter to make it a wholly unique film that it really honestly deserves to be. It's only unique in that odd animation curiosity way, but not in that unique kind of interesting movie experience way, which is really, I think, what they were aiming for, but they unfortunately failed to do. And what you get is a typical big budget animated movie at the time, which is actually not made like a typical big budget animated movie at the time. So it's kind of a walking contradiction that honestly wasn't really that fun to watch. So if you have seen Dinosaur and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to.